Hi, good evening, everybody. Dr. Misty here. Thanks for joining me on Wellness Wednesday. It's been quite a bit. I've honestly been doing a lot on my own healing journey. So it's great to be back tonight. And let me know if you can hear me okay. I'm trying out some new things on my computer. Um, I feel like this is a really, really good topic to talk about right now, especially as the world's starting to change again. I feel like there's a lot of people that I have seen via telehealth for functional medicine over the past year that have really had exacerbations of their issues. To be honest, myself included, certain symptoms. So I feel like this is a great time to talk about um, what health challenges, besides on the psychological level, that chronic trauma survivors face. So we know trauma survivors, meaning people who had high ACE scores, high adverse childhood experiences, um, developmental type of trauma, ongoing trauma, abuse, war victims, things like that. But particularly more on the levels of um, more childhood adversity. So we know that those things are going to create issues on the mental health level, such as complex PTSD. They may create issues on the level of anxiety, depression, bipolar. For some people, it may lead into borderline personality, some personality issues as well. I'm going to delve more into the health aspect of that because that's where I really specialize in. Although we can definitely talk about the other aspect on another video. Um, so some of the five top health issues um, that trauma survivors may be experiencing now, especially after the year we've been through. A lot of trauma is coming up for people, especially throughout some pauses we've been through, being having to sit still with our thoughts and our feelings and really have everything being put on hold has created a movement of reflection, but it also has challenged a lot of probably your coping mechanisms, your belief systems, probably your sanity at some levels, right? Um, so, with that trauma coming up, you might also know and see within yourself or somebody else that you know that is a trauma survivor, you might see and notice these symptoms, okay? So, number one is actually chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. So, very similar diseases. So, I'm stating this as there's many dysfunctions that show up, but I'm going to specifically focus on like diseases and diagnosis right now. So, chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. So, if you've noticed that your body is absolutely, if you've been carrying a lot more stress and you have noticed that it's really difficult getting out of bed, that you're having insomnia, that you're waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning, if you feel like your limbs are heavy, that you can't get through the day, or it's more than your whole body feels weighted. Also, if you feel more heavy and tired after exertion. Um, so these are all signs of potential chronic fatigue syndrome. Okay. Um, so fibromyalgia and chronic pain being the second. Okay. Chronic pain is huge with trauma survivors. Our emotions, a lot of people who have been through developmental trauma, specifically, if you've had emotional neglect, abuse, or psychological abuse, you may have been somebody who really has pushed down or swallowed a lot in order to, stay safe in your environment. And so, as you know, when we're young, we are constantly, our brain is constantly developing, but over time, as you have kind of like settle into these patterns, they become your patterns into adulthood, which ends up translating into the disease process. That's really important for us to understand, because that chronic toxic stress that you might be stuck in, um, your habit is to swallow your emotions, or swallow the pain, or the boundary invasions, or anything like that. And so that translates somewhere. That's almost like an energy, that kind of sticks with you. And so there's a lot of thoughts on fibromyalgia, and there's a lot of physiological aspects to it. Typically it does show up with people who have a highly traumatic past, because of specific activity in our brain, and how much the pain centers in the brain actually get activated, and can get activated when certain memories are either triggered or anything like that. So that's something to really understand. If you notice that, wow, I don't know why, I don't know what my problem is, I feel like my body is like, I'm getting like massive headaches, I'm getting arm pain, I'm getting leg pain, and now I'm getting abdominal pain. Like you get like all these weird traveling pains. And there's not necessarily like, you can't, you might have been somebody who's been through a multitude of MRIs or X-rays and things like that. You just can't get your finger on anything, but you know that it's not, you know, you may have had somebody, unfortunately, that's been told like, well, it's you're exaggerating, or things like that, like some secondary gaslighting from any part of your medical team, that unfortunately happens, which is also sometimes can exacerbate the symptoms. um, so it's important to understand that those types of things can absolutely be fibromyalgia, and they absolutely can be um, kind of from a lot of the long-term trauma that you've been carrying around, or has been unprocessed. Um, so things that might show up with fibromyalgia, or again, the traveling pains, similar to chronic fatigue, like a lot of tired in the morning, um, really sensitive to light touch, also can be one of those types of symptoms. Um, Also, if you have a lot of pain in your shoulder blades, and like the back part of your neck, behind your elbows, behind your knees, there's a bunch of different spots that your body, you have to diagnose fibromyalgia. But really, um, that is something that's absolutely valid. That's something that could be escalating if you are starting to face some of your trauma, or you're processing your trauma, or you have new trauma that you've experienced, um, such as what we went through this past year. Um, that could have re-triggered a lot of stuff, and now you notice that your pain symptoms are way worse, right? So that's number two. Okay. So number three is actually a little bit more unknown and undiagnosed, and something that I see in patients very regularly. And that is autoimmune disease. Okay. This is documented in um, medical journals with ACE studies. So patients who have four or more, specifically six or more, between four and six, the scale goes from 1 to 10, um, adverse childhood experiences, then you are much more like, you're hundreds% more likely to have certain things. So this is something that's really important. As if there are any, I want to get this out to even other doctors, medical providers. It's really important that if somebody is experiencing a large number of symptoms, um, it doesn't mean they're necessarily malingering, or anything like that. Like, that is a red flag that somebody has a lot of pain, or a really big past that needs to be addressed, that isn't being addressed. So that's something to consider. And so autoimmune conditions, if somebody comes in and they have an intake, and they have on their intake that they had abuse in the past, and that they were unsafe in their home or anything like that, um, that is absolutely okay. I need to be looking at specific diseases, and autoimmune is absolutely one of them. This doesn't get run nearly enough as it needs to. So autoimmune conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, also linked with psoriasis and skin conditions. Um, there's different types of actual diagnostic autoimmune conditions. There's lupus, there's celiac disease, there's multiple sclerosis. Um, Really, sometimes it doesn't even have to be a full-blown disease process. Sometimes the numbers, especially for patients with like fibromyalgia, you're going to notice that there's a link between fibromyalgia and people who show up positive for what's called an ANA test. Um, so these things usually, I run lab work with patients and seeing the instances where so much inflammation has been built up, and the person is having an active autoimmune process, but really their symptoms are like depression and tired, and typically they're told, hey, go get more exercise or eat better or things like that. And really there's sometimes like it's important to know that information. So if you are a medical provider or you're a patient, you can take that to your medical provider too if you're getting help for these things like, hey, what about, what about autoimmune and investigating autoimmune? And with autoimmune, which means self-attack, right? How many survivors out there are great at self-attack emotionally? I happen to be an expert at that. um, it's really like when, especially if you're an abusive, like the emotional stuff, it translates physically. It translates physically. It's very connected. Think about the amount of times that in order to stay safe, a child has to self-attack, because it can't be their caregiver because they have to stay safe. So they will self-attack and self-abuse to the point where that carries into adulthood in addictions, emotional eating, eating disorders, things like that. So, self attack is also perpetuating feelings of defeat, disgust, hopelessness. Um, and really, those feelings can really bring about disease in the body. And that's so important to understand. So, self attack is really an autoimmune, our autoimmune process is our immune system is actually attacking our own cells. So our bodies begin to attack themselves. Okay. So, it's important to understand that one of the reasons also why there's autoimmune conditions is because of the suppression of the immune system during the developmental process because of the chronic toxic stress load. So if you grew up in a very stressful and traumatic environment, what's going to happen is that you're going to have brain changes from that. And what also is going to happen is that essentially you're on this chronic stress loop. So your body is amazing at adapting. Okay. So in order to fight the stress, your body will adapt. Okay. So it'll adapt to, dissociative issues. It'll adapt to fight or flight. Our body has these amazing autonomic um, systems that are in place for when something scary happens. Okay, so if something scary happens enough and chronically, think about the chemistry that's going through your body all the time. The cortisol, the cortisol bringing up, raising glucose levels, things like that. So that's like chronic, chronic, chronic. And so basically, the patient, the higher the stress, the lower the immunity. So if the person is not able to, their immune system is not functioning well, and if that happens and they have too much cortisol, their inflammation is not regularly managed very well. Okay, so it kind of all works together. There's a lot of like inflammatory cascades being set off. Okay, so autoimmune conditions, things that you want to look out for with autoimmune conditions. Okay, swelling, joint pain, um, fatigue, skin issues, particularly if they are in a butterfly rash, okay, a rash across the face, even other specific types of skin issues or that psoriasis, if you have psoriasis. And even I'm going to go as far as to say things like eczema and things like that, if you have like chronic flare ups of that or you're maybe chronically getting sick. Okay. There's also, I mentioned the joint pain aspect of it. Pain is definitely a big part of it. It usually shows up. Pain and fatigue are usually the biggest pieces of autoimmune, depending on how it's showing up. So I want to move on to the other ones, and this is a big one, um, that also links to the chronic stress aspect, and one that so many people actually experience, which is irritable bowel syndrome. Okay, this is a very big problem for a lot of people, um, who are trauma survivors and non-trauma survivors. Okay, so if you are a trauma survivor, chronic trauma survivor with high levels of stress, what happens is actually your sympathetic nervous system kind of goes haywire. Okay, and so it stimulates specific processes in the body for that fight or flight reaction. Sometimes if you like think of it as like you got nervous on a test or something, right? Some people who get nervous, like I remember like, taking tests for my board exams and things like that with other colleagues, and it was like half of us were like, oh my God, I have to go to the bathroom again before we go take the test or whatever, because it's like your sympathetic nervous system kicks on because you're feeling anxiety and fearful and things like that. That can absolutely happen. You can have GI distress from stress. But also, typically, if you are somebody with a lowered immune system and you have irritable bowel system, typically, and you do have chronic trauma, this might be also linked to things like addictions. So whether that be alcohol, sugar, anything, cigarettes, drugs, anything to have your immune system suppressed. And but also like if it's more on the level of alcohol or food, you're more than likely going to be craving things on like the sugary or carbohydrate or fatty level, for emotional comfort, right? Um, Same thing with alcohol is going to really rip apart your stomach. So you could be somebody who has those kind of long-term things, but then it's showing up as irritable bowel syndrome later on. The other thing I want to mention with that is that if you've had if your immune system's down and you've been sick a lot, and you've been on lots of rounds of antibiotics throughout your life, that can also be very problematic with irritable bowel. Irritable bowel syndrome is kind of like a junk term thrown around, similar to chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. Their diagnostic criteria is symptoms. So the underlying issues are high levels of dysfunction in the body. Um, so with irritable bowel, there's a high level of what's called dysbiosis, which means like the gut bacteria and the good bacteria is not doing so good. There could be inflammation in the GI tract lining. There could be, a high amount of small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, that's causing a lot of problems as well. So that's typically what's meant by irritable bowel syndrome. There's no necessarily pathology, to the cells going on. It's basically like you're getting consistent irritability, chronic diarrhea, constipation, alternating depending on what food you eat. It's hard for you to go out places, you stay near a bathroom, things like that. And it typically happens with trauma survivors. There's a big emotional link too when they have those flare-ups. So, um, just keep that one in mind. There's a multitude of underlying reasons for irritable bowel, but that is one of the bigger health problems that trauma survivors do have. The other and the last, number five, problem that is one of the most common and ironically is one of the most leading causes of death, is actually cardiovascular and pulmonary disease. Okay, so this makes a lot of sense actually. And the reason that makes sense is because, um, you know, our body, when we're under that level of stress, think about again, the level of how that affects the heart, how that affects, your body and your cardiovascular system, all that stress on your body consistently, the cortisol levels going up, it's spiking your blood glucose. There's a lot going on there, that leads to cardiovascular health. Also, your body, your heart rate's going up and down. Um, it's one of those things that's also linked to obesity, and being overweight, which is something that's very common in survivors also. Those two kind of go hand in hand. The pulmonary aspect is really, also linked to like heavy smoking addictions and things like that. So if you look at all those, and it's really, really interesting to look at what some of the leading causes of death are, as well as the astounding statistics in how many people are, abused during childhood. It really is. I mean, just on kids with, trigger warning for what I'm mentioning, kids who have been sexually abused, it's 1 in every 4 girls and 1 in every 6 boys. So that's like the latest data. That's just sexual abuse. That's not even emotional abuse. That's not even physical abuse. So again, the more, and typically those are together. You know what I mean? A lot of those are together. So, um, I just kind of want to bring that full circle to let you guys know like how common these things are, and that there's reasons. It's not all of the reason, but it's a very underlooked reason for why there are disease processes. Our body has, an amazing adaptability, which is the beautiful part if all this stuff is able to be caught and dealt with, that your body is actually capable of releasing and healing from these things. That's the beautiful part of it, is that our body is so adaptive, and our minds are so adaptive, and our cells are so adaptive, right? So, and this is one of the things that, I've gone through myself, as well as, helped other patients, and clients who have been through, a multitude of, chronic issues in their life. So many of them come in with very similar, patterns and backgrounds and different types of these types of, symptoms. It's very, very, very common. So I hope that gives you an idea of, what our bodies hold physically from all of the trauma, that was carried long time ago, throughout childhood and into our adulthood. If you are a chronic trauma survivor, there's absolute hope and there's absolute help. And I just want people to know and understand that. I think it's really important that we try and link this this problem, um, to physical health issues. I don't feel like this is being addressed well enough, and it's possible to get these things better. So if you resonate with any of this video, I appreciate you watching. My heart is with you for whatever it is that you have experienced. And if you do want any help, you can message me on, Dr. Misty. I can answer any questions you have or talk to you about, some of the services that I do to work with people with functional medicine and telehealth. Um, but please know that you aren't alone, and especially during a time like we are in now, I feel like I want this to be an empowering message for people who have long-term chronic health issues and suffering to know that it doesn't have to be an ongoing death sentence for them. So I hope this is a message of hope for you that there are ways that you can address these things. These are the most common. You're not alone. And please be your own advocate. Please keep looking into your own health. Take that responsibility. Don't give up. And I'm here to help if you need anything. It's great to see you guys again. I'm Dr. Misty, and thanks so much for joining. If you want any more information, you can go to www.drmisty.com. I also have a virtual clinic, which is www.newhorizonchiro.com. That's CHIRO. And you can learn a little bit more on the physical aspect of what I do to help people. Okay? Thanks so much. Bye bye.